Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Greek Dark Ages. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see what happens after things fall apart. So, what we're going to start by looking at is the Bronze Age collapse, what's collapsing, why that's happening. Afterwards, we're going to see what's so dark about the Dark Ages, right? Why do we call them the Dark Ages? We'll figure that out. From there, we're going to see if we can pick up any kind of hints of light within the Dark Ages. And then we'll wrap up with some thoughts about the Dark Ages in total. So, the Bronze Age collapse, let's go ahead and touch base on that. Remember, with the Bronze Age, we are talking about that period of time that goes from around 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. And with that, we're looking at cultures across the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the Near East. So we've got the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland, we've got the Minoans on the island of Crete, the Egyptians in the Nile River Valley, and a whole slew of different civilizations in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, such as the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And then you can go ahead and put the Hittites in Anatolia as well. And what we're seeing with the Bronze Age, right, is the rise of complexity, right? The rise of different things, sometimes what we'd call the rise of civilization. And while that lasts for a pretty long time, from almost 2,000 years, from around 3000 to 1200 BC, it doesn't last forever. And what we see right around 1200 are a series of destruction layers throughout the coast of the Mediterranean, right? So throughout Greece, along the Levant here, we get wars fought down in Egypt, and even destruction layers in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley and in central Anatolia. Now, Egypt, they're blaming the Sea Peoples, right? This kind of mix and match group of people from across the Mediterranean. And scholars today have tried to link those up to actual groups we know about. But more recently, scholars have started thinking that it's actually a variety of things that's causing this collapse. So it's not just invaders from abroad, although that might be part of it. It's also internal rebellions, it's environmental issues such as droughts, such as earthquakes, that sort of thing. And all these things lead to a breakdown in trade networks, which further isolate each community from one another and cause the kind of full-scale collapse of these state-level and empire-level societies. Now, we are entering the period that we call the Dark Ages, right? So starting somewhere around 1200, 1150 BC. And let's talk a little bit about what makes the Dark Ages dark. So, why do we call them the Dark Ages? Well, the basic idea here is that we're going to lose all the complexity, right? We've just talked about complexity being one of the things that defines the Bronze Age. Now we are going to lose that. Things are going to become much more simple in terms of material culture, in terms of social organization, in terms of art and architecture. All these things end up being simplified. So, the first things we lose in the Aegean world, right, are all of Minoan and Mycenaean culture, right? Just about everything that you associate with these cultures, right? All the things that make Minoans Minoans and Mycenaeans Mycenaeans, they all tend to disappear. And perhaps the most famous things, right, associated with those cultures are their palaces. And so we've got the plan of the Minoan Palace at Knossos over here. And what I'm going to have you do is take a look at how that compares to the biggest building we've got over the 500-year period of the Greek Dark Ages, all right? And that's what's known as the Heroon, all right? And we'll talk more about this later, the Heroon at Lefkandi. And so if you look at the scales, this is maybe 100 feet long total. It was actually a burial for one of the Dark Age heroes. But the palace over here, this is hundreds of feet long, hundreds of feet wide, well over 10 times the size of what we're looking at over here. So, monumental architecture disappears. That's the first sign that you're in a Dark Age. Next up, what we see in the Bronze Age is we see fairly large settlements, all right? And so this is an actual picture of a Bronze Age settlement, but you get the idea, right? We get big settlements during the Bronze Age. During the Dark Ages, all right, what we end up seeing are much smaller settlements. Okay, so any settlement that you see ends up being smaller than a similar, the equivalent settlement in the Bronze Age. And it's not just that the settlements are smaller, there are actually a lot fewer of them as well. So if we simply count up all the Bronze Age sites that we have in the Greek world, and we compare them to all the different Dark Age sites that we have in the Greek world, we end up with something like over 300 Bronze Age sites based on this type of pottery that we're finding, and we end up with something like 40 Dark Age sites. And so what that ends up meaning, right, is that we think that there was a huge decline in population during the Greek Dark Ages, which ended up culminating in a lot fewer sites, and the sites that we do have there being a lot smaller. The next thing that we see, and this kind of accompanies this idea, is a lack of centralized government. And so we've talked about this a little bit here, whereas what we're thinking of in the Bronze Age, when we look at the Minoan palaces at sites like Knossos, and the Mycenaean Palace at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, what we think is happening is that the citizens, right, the people of these cultures are farming or raising animals or doing something along those lines, making wine or olive oil. And they're sending whatever they specialize in to the palace to be stored in these different little areas. And then the palace itself is taking those goods and redistributing them to the people. And what that means is that you can specialize, right? If your land is awesome for olive oil and it stinks for raising goats, you don't need to raise goats because you can get your goats from the government, all right? You specialize in just olive oil, produce a ton of that, do a really good job, send it to the central palace, and then they will redistribute the diversity of resources you need to you. Now we lose that during the Dark Ages here, all right? And what we end up seeing are much smaller, more isolated settlements. All right, now, not only do we get a far less centralized society, right, with individual kind of farmsteads rather than strong centralized cities and governments, we also end up seeing much poorer burials. So the material culture itself ends up suffering. So we've seen with Minoan and Mycenaean material culture these elaborate frescoes and these kind of amazing inlaid daggers and these golden burial masks like the Mask of Agamemnon over here. When we get to the Dark Ages, we pretty much just have pottery, all right? Now all periods have pottery, and pottery is wonderful for an archaeologist because even though it breaks and becomes useless, it never totally disintegrates. So we have pottery for thousands and thousands of years. And it allows us to date when things occur. But in terms of the artistic sophistication between something like the Mask of Agamemnon and something like this, a pot in a Dark Age burial, there's no real contest between the kind of level of sophistication taken or needed to develop these different things. So we see a big decline in terms of how rich the burials are. And that kind of goes generally for art. So if we look even within the world of ceramics, during the Bronze Age, we get these kind of floral and faunal motifs. These octopus vases are very characteristic of Minoan culture. And in the Dark Ages, what we're getting are very basic geometric motifs, where all iconography, and by iconography I mean pictures of people and plants and animals, right? Pictures of things. That disappears and it just becomes basic geometric stuff. We also see that there's a reduction in the kind of scale of trade and the distance that trade is going. So long distance trade diminishes. So we can see from the Bronze Age that we've got evidence of things like Egyptians trading with Minoans. And so on the site of Crete, we can find these Egyptian scarab beetle seals, okay? And we see those as evidence that Egyptians and Minoans had economic relations with each other. During the Dark Ages, pretty much all we're getting is pottery. We can tell from the form of the pottery and what it's made of that the pottery is made locally, right? So not only do you just have pottery, you're not even going very far to get it, right? You're just making it for yourself or having somebody in your neighborhood make it. And that's where the material culture, the extent to which it kind of travels in the Dark Age world. And once again, we see a disappearance of writing. So think about this. Like writing, they forget how to write. This is crazy, right? So during the Bronze Age, we see these things like the Linear B tablets. And we talked about how they are these administrative counting receipts, right? This many goats comes into the palace, this many bushels of grain or olive oil or wine. And during the Dark Ages, they basically don't have any of that anymore. And the thinking here, the reason that they forget to write is that they no longer really have a purpose to do so. So during the Bronze Age, because we have these strong centralized governments, they need to keep track of everything that's coming into and out of the palace. Once you don't have a palace, and once people are becoming self-sufficient rather than sending all their stuff to a centralized place and then expecting something in return, you don't really have a need to be able to account for those things, and thus writing disappears. So, after being able to write for hundreds of years, they forget how to write for hundreds of years. Now, so those are all the things that are falling apart. Do we have anything to hang our hats on here? Is anything good going on during the Dark Ages? In a sense, is there any light? And there is some. This was on the title slide here, and what you're looking at is a plan of the Heroon of Left Candie. All right. Now, when you see this term, the Heroon, all right, it's Heroon, and the little umlaut there designates a new syllable. That's why it's like the Heroon, rather than the Haroon. And Left Candie is one of the sites in eastern Greece. Now, what we're looking at here is essentially a giant burial, something along the lines of 100 feet long. You can see it's a long, skinny thing, an apsidal room at the very, very end, and then the person would have been buried in the center in these shaft graves. And what this is telling us is that there is still some sort of stratification. So not everybody was being buried in these things. He must have been a leader within the particular community that he was buried in. And you can see over here a reconstruction of what this would have looked like. Again, big for the Dark Ages. In the scope of Bronze Age things, in the scope of the pyramids and the temples and the palaces of Knossos and Mycenae, not quite on the same scale. But at the time, this is the biggest thing that we've got. And we can see some of the grave goods here that art hadn't totally died. Even though the vast majority of pottery that we get, if it's decorated at all, are these kind of simple geometric designs, we do get this kind of cool centaur guy over here with kind of a geometric design on him, so that's iconographic in the form of the thing itself. We do get a little bit of gold jewelry involved in the burial here as well, and we can see that the hero, right, there were actually two, a man and a woman, are buried along with their horse over here as well. And so there is some richness to the finds, even if it's not at the same level as what was going on during the Bronze Age. So, a few concluding thoughts. With the Bronze Age, we have things like these giant palaces that signal centralized government and redistributive economies. We lose that completely during the Dark Ages. There are no more palaces, and we think that ends up changing the social structure as well. So no longer do people send things to a centralized point and receive something in return. People become much more self-sufficient. In turn, people end up living in smaller communities, more isolated from other people, having less trade with other people, and that ends up coming across in the material culture that we end up finding as archaeologists. We do get some level of development. We can see things like the Heroon at Left Candie, the hero of Left Candie, buried in this kind of 100-foot long structure in these shaft graves with some level of kind of sophisticated and rich grave goods, right? A little bit of gold jewelry, horses, the little centaur guy. And so it's not totally dark, but we've seen something that's a far cry from what we saw during the Bronze Age, both on the Minoan sites of Crete and the Mycenaean sites of the Greek mainland. So that's it for the Dark Ages. Thanks for paying attention to the Greek Dark Ages.